Peace and good, and greetings once again from here at the Shrine of St. Anthony. And today we're in the Friary Chapel upstairs in the living quarters of the Friary, where our program originates today. And we continue our reflections on the Sunday readings, and we're already up now to the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Last week in our time together, we considered how do you go from a reading to a homily, you might say. And we kind of went through the process, you might say. A little long, but hopefully you found it helpful and interesting. And I'd like to continue on with that in a fashion. Again, not to redo the process, but to focus on one particular aspect of the process of interpreting a text, and a very important one. In fact, especially when it comes to the Gospels, it's a critical element of interpretation, that if you don't understand it, you're going to make huge mistakes and offer rather poor, incorrect, naive readings of the text. So, but before we get into that, let's listen to the Gospel. And once again, we're going to focus on the Gospel this week. And this is slightly after the Gospel from last week, and that will play into what we're going to say momentarily, okay? So the apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you. Who among you would say to your slave, who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here immediately and take your place at table'? Would he not rather say to him, 'Prepare something for me to eat'? Put on your apron and wait on me while I eat and drink. You may eat and drink when I am finished.' Is he grateful to that slave because he did what he was commanded? So should it be with you. When you have done all you have been commanded, say, 'We are unprofitable slaves. We have done what we were obliged to do.'" So that's the reading today. Now, I've made one slight change to the text, and it's not really a change, it's a correction. For whatever reason, the current version of the lectionary has turned the word slave, which is really the correct translation, to servant. I don't know why, I've got my suppositions, but the word should be slave. And in fact, when you turn it from servant to slave, you've destroyed, in a very real way, the significance of the text, right? Especially from where we stand. Right? Think of what a servant is. A servant is a hired hand, you might say. Right? They are paid for their work. Right? A slave is something quite different. Right? The word is slave. It's not servant. Okay? And in fact, as I began at the beginning, I mentioned there's a particular aspect of interpretation that we need to be attentive to. And it's very related to that word, okay? But before I say that, go there, this text follows almost immediately after what we saw last week. And remember, in the main body of the gospel last week was the famous story of Lazarus and the rich man, right? And we reflected at that time that if you limit, right, your interpretation of that text to the rich man as a rich man and Lazarus as a poor man, literally, right, you're going to get really weird readings of the text, right? Because what does that say then? Rich people are bad, poor people are good, right? That's not the point of the text. We talked about that last week. What we did say, though, was that because one is rich, then that might change or shape how one views the world and themselves, right? The rich person is one who trusts in themselves. They've got everything they need. They've worked hard, perhaps, or they've been even abusive to others, and they've got it through ill-gotten gains. But however they got it, the trap of being rich is that one can become misled into believing that one is self-sufficient. Whereas the poor person has to trust in the kindness of others, whether it be others or other, right? That's the point of the story, as we talked about last week, right? So hence, the text is not demonizing wealth, and it's not promoting abject poverty, because as we know, abject poverty is an evil, right? All right. Now, what are those two images then? The rich man and the poor Lazarus. Metaphors. And that's what we want to focus upon today. So, what's a metaphor, right? Well, I looked up the definition, and hopefully you find this helpful. If you're not familiar with the idea, right? A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a term or phrase is applied to something to which it is not literally applicable in order to suggest a resemblance. As in, and this is actually the dictionary example. This is kind of a little shout out to our Lutheran brothers and sisters who might be watching. As in, a mighty fortress is our God, right? God is not a fort. That's obvious, right? But there's something about that image, right, of fortress that communicates something about God. Once you literalize the metaphor, it becomes ridiculous, silly, and dead, right? To speak of God as a fortress, as a building, is ridiculous, right? The second definition is something used or regarded as being used to represent something else. That's a good definition, isn't it? That's really what we're talking about. So, and the word that we use often for that is a symbol, right? A symbol represents something else, right? And indeed, the word metaphor comes from the Greek, which means to transfer. And it's kind of like a bridge, isn't it? It's a bridge between something very literal to something meaningful. See? Good. So that's why last week, rich and poor are metaphors. We're not to read those literally, right? It's not about demonizing the rich and idolizing the poor, right? Now, what was behind all of that last week, you might remember, and maybe you don't, and I'll tell you, right? Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and again, he's using them as a metaphor, right? And in fact, this is very related to today, right? So the Pharisees, as presented in the Gospels, again, this may not be terribly historically accurate, but the Pharisees serve as a metaphor in the Gospels, right? They are a metaphor for people who see themselves as self-sufficient. They follow the law, they follow the prophets, right? Or they claim to, right? And therefore they're better than everybody else, right? And they see it as, well, I'm doing this on my own. It's all about them, right? A good warning for all of us today, right? Isn't that one of the great traps of religion, right? That it become that our religious practice, our religious devotion can become twisted, and it becomes not about God, but about me. Look at me, right? Got to be careful with that, right? So the idea was, behind that text last week is, who is the poor person? The poor person is the person who trusts in God, who trusts in and has faith in the law and the prophets, and lives the law and the prophets, right? Not out of any sense of gain, but as their essential reality of life, right? Whereas the rich person, self-sufficient, right? I'll give God his 10%, but I'm going to like do my own thing, and I'm okay, right? Today we see those same themes carried forward, and now Jesus is talking to his apostles, right? He's not talking to the Pharisees anymore. He's talking to his closest followers, right? And he's giving this kind of chiding, right? If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, if you have faith, and clearly the implication is that they don't, because if they did, you would say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Well, nowhere in the text does it say a bunch of mulberry trees ended up in the Mediterranean, right? So they're being challenged. They're being challenged. It's not just about, oh, look at those bad, silly Pharisees. Now it's about us. Now it's about us. And in turn, you and me, right? You and me. We are being challenged here. And now Jesus is turning to another metaphor, slave. Now again, you can't take this literally. Once you've made this literal, you've got a lot of either a very silly read of the text or a very naive read of the text, or worse, a dangerous read of the text, right? Because if you are a person who has power in this community, right, and you see the others as slaves, how are you going to treat those people? Again, this is potentially a very dangerous text unless we read it correctly. Because the reality is in the text, we are all called to see ourselves in the mirror of the metaphor of a slave. Again, this is not promoting slavery, right? In Jesus' world, Jesus assumes, does not really question the status quo, right? He's using the images from his world to talk to the people of his time. So he's not idolizing slavery. What he's saying is that there's something about the relationship between the slave and the master that is meaningful, right? And then he has those examples, right? So if the master comes home, the master doesn't say, oh, slave, thanks for coming by. Yeah, sit down, I'll fix you something to eat. That's just not what happened in that world, right? The slave was there to fix the master's food, to take care of the master. And when you're done, take care of yourself, knock yourself out, right? What does that mean then for us, right? And Jesus tells us really in the last sentence of the text that we have before us today, because he says, so should it be with you. What does that mean? Do we see ourselves literally as God's slaves? No. That's dangerous too, right? Because if you see yourself as God's slave, at some point you're going to be resentful, and you're going to want to be liberated, right? So we can't read this literally, right? When you have done all you have been commanded, this goes back now to last week's gospel. What does that mean? When you live the law and the prophets. This is really important, right? Christians, we sometimes tend to think that Jesus came and got rid of all that 600 and some commandment business. Forget all of that. We got a new way of doing things, right? In fact, we mistakenly talk about the New Testament and the Old Testament because the Old Testament means that it must be like, the old version, right? There is continuity between the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, right? And in fact, if you carefully read the law and the prophets, there's an incredibly and this is a word we have to be careful with, right? But a just view of human life, right? In that world, right? For example, right? In that world, you couldn't charge interest for a loan to another member of the community, right? Think about that for a second. Think back, just read the news in recent times of the economic situation we find ourselves in, right? All this business about setting interest rates, right? And we got to raise them to fix the economy. And if we do that, a whole bunch of people are going to lose their jobs, and that's okay. Is that okay? Is that the way to go? Right? Last week we were reading from Ecclesiastes, right? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. There is nothing new under the sun. I got way off track here, but we will go back. Let's finish this up. All right. So we need to see ourselves as, why do we do what we do? This is the point of the text, isn't it? Why do we do what we do? One way we can think about this is, hey, God, I'm doing you a favor, right? Hey, you know, I say my prayers. I go to Mass on Sunday, right? I throw something in the basket. I got baptized. I got all my paperwork in order, right? I throw a check your way every once in a while, right? That's one way to look at discipleship. Clearly not the right way, right? We're not doing God any favors by living the way that the law and the prophets has communicated, are we? Right? In fact, what we're doing is we're living the way human beings were intended to live from the very beginning, right? We should be thankful to God for the law and the prophets and the teachings of the gospel, right? Because they show us how we're supposed to live, right? And when we do that, right, we're not doing God a favor, we're doing ourselves a favor. And indeed, isn't that the way to freedom? Isn't that the way to true freedom? Right? As opposed to being a slave. Right? And of course, Jesus will use those metaphors in John's gospel, right? You know, up to now I've called you slaves, but now I call you friends. Right? So again, hopefully through this we've seen the power of metaphor. Number one. Number two, that a literal metaphor is dead and can be incredibly dangerous, right? We're going to come back. Next week's gospel builds on this one. So we're going to continue this thread, right, of seeing how, starting with the Pharisees and Lazarus and the rich man, now we've gone through the slave business, and now we're going to come to a miracle story of all things, but they all go together. All right. Well, enough for today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your support. Thank you for all that you do to support our ministry here. We're very grateful for that. We were just having a conversation this past week amongst the kind of the team here, and just we're just realizing, you know, how generous you have been to us, right? And how your support is just so meaningful. In the sense of it encourages us to keep going with providing the insight and hopefully the input that you might find helpful and meaningful in your life. So thank you. Thank you for supporting us in this ministry and allowing it to expand to hopefully to more people, right? Again, you are our companions, and we're all companions of St. Anthony. So until next time, peace and good.